Doc Sullivan was halfway through his second pint of Sleeman's when he leaned over the table at the Old Salt in Halifax and said, "Cal, you've got to tell them about the Carmichael kid." It was the second Thursday of the month, the night us old Royal Canadian Navy boys from Legion Branch 12 always got together, 6 of us in our 50s and 60s, still working the defense contractor circuit between Ottawa and the Maritimes. "Which Carmichael kid?" I asked, even though I already knew exactly who he meant. "The trust fund punk who fired you 48 hours before your bonus paid out and ended up turning his father's whole company into ash. Dean McIntyre, who'd served with me on HMCS Windsor back in the early 2000s, gave a low whistle and waved at the bartender for another round. This I have got to hear. I'm Calvin Thibault, by the way, 54 years old, 23 years in the Royal Canadian Navy, Royal Military College class of 2000. Most of my service was on long-range patrol submarines, doing signals intelligence work in places I still can't talk about, even with my ex-wife. Picked up a meritorious service medal for something I did in the Strait of Hormuz that'll stay sealed until I'm in the ground. These days I drive a Ford F-150 with too many kilometers on it, and until about a year ago I worked in the defense contractor world out of Mississauga, designing encryption architectures that keep Canadian and Allied forces secure overseas. "All right," I said, settling back against the worn leather of the booth. "But you fellas aren't going to believe how a 29-year-old MBA managed to hand me a $50 million company just because he couldn't stomach the idea of me getting a performance bonus." The whole thing started on a Tuesday morning in late October. I was in the main conference room at Cascade Defense Technologies, briefing 3 senior officials from the Department of National Defense on our latest encryption protocol. Colonel Vanessa Dumace from Canadian Forces Cyber Command, Dr. Mice from Canadian Forces Cyber Command, Henrik Voss from Defense Research and Development Canada in Valcartier, and Commander Devon Forsyth from Naval Intelligence in Ottawa. These aren't the kind of people you keep waiting. These are the people who can decide with one signature whether a Canadian patrol boat in the Black Sea can still talk securely to NORAD. You bring them coffee and you mind your manners. Hayden Carmichael didn't knock. The conference room door swung open like he was busting into a frat house, and in he strutted, wearing a Navy 3-piece suit that probably cost more than what most of these officers made in a month, looking like he'd just stepped off the back of a Muskoka cottage boat. "Dad needs you to wrap this up," he announced, not even glancing at the 3 people in uniform across the table. "I've got real business to discuss." Now, 23 years in the submarine service teaches you to read a room in about 2 seconds. I'd handled classified briefings with admirals who could end a career with one raised eyebrow. But what I just witnessed wasn't a junior officer making a tactical mistake. This was deliberate disrespect, dressed in a boss suit. Colonel Dumas slowly lifted her eyes from her notes, and let me tell you, when a colonel from Cyber Command gives you that look, you can feel the temperature in the room drop. Dr. Voss stopped mid-sentence with his pen still hovering. Commander Forsyth, who I'd actually shared a wardroom with briefly out of Halifax back in '09, just stared at the carpet, jaw working. "Folks," I said, keeping my voice level the way they teach you at the college, "I apologize for the interruption. Could we perhaps reconvene tomorrow morning? My team will make sure your travel arrangements are extended." After they filed out stone-faced, professional, not a word said but 100 said anyway, Hayden plopped himself down into the chair at the head of the table like he'd just conquered Europe. The silence stretched out until he finally spoke. "Dad wants to see you in his office, now." Brock chuckled and shook his head. "Kid had no idea who he was screwing with, did he?" "None at all," I said. "See, Hayden was Wallace Carmichael's son. Wallace was the CEO. Decent man. Former Canadian Army officer, served in Bosnia and later in Kandahar, took over the company from the founder back around 2012 and understood how to treat the people who actually built the products. But Hayden? 29 years old, Rotman School MBA, never served a day in his life, and absolutely convinced he was the smartest person in any room he walked into. He'd been Vice President of Strategic Initiatives for about 11 months, a title his father had invented because his mother wouldn't stop asking when Hayden was going to be given something to do. The walk from the conference room down to Wallace's corner office felt like a death march, except I wasn't the one about to die. I just didn't realize that yet. Hayden strutted ahead of me, probably picturing himself in a documentary about ruthless young executives. What he didn't know was that he'd just lit the fuse on something that was going to incinerate his father's company by the end of the week. "You've got to understand," I told the guys at the Old Salt. "I'd been at Cascade for 19 years. Started there fresh out of the Navy, when we were just 14 engineers in a converted bottling plant in Brampton. Back then our founder was still running the place. Brigadier-General Maxwell Beauchamp, retired. The Bear, we used to call him." Dean leaned forward. "Bear Beauchamp. I remember that name. Old school Canadian forces. The best," I agreed. The Bear understood something Hayden never would, that the people who actually build the technology should have a say in who gets to control it. He watched what happened to other Canadian defense firms in the 90s when the bean counters and the family heirs took the wheel. Good engineers shown the door to make the quarterly numbers prettier for the markets. Patents sold off to American firms for a fraction of their worth. The Bear had decided, somewhere around 2014, that he wasn't going to let that happen to Cascade. About 11 years back, after a company barbecue at Beauchamp's place out in the Gatineau Hills, he pulled me aside. We ended up on his back deck with a bottle of Crown Royal Northern Harvest between us, the river running below, talking about the future of the company and the future of Canadian sovereignty in defense tech. "Calvin," he said, "I'm putting something special in your contract. That annual performance bonus you earn? The moment it's actually paid out into your account, the intellectual property rights to the entire Cascade Core encryption suite transfer to you. Legally. Permanently." Holy, I damn near choked on my rye. "Sir, what on earth are you talking about?" "Insurance," he said, refilling my glass. "For you, for the technology, for the men and women who use it overseas. The board can't sell it. The board can't license it to the wrong people. And no incompetent heir can ever destroy what we've built here." At the time, I thought he was being paranoid. Cascade was rock solid, profitable, growing. We had contracts with our allies, exclusive deals with the RCAF, a backlog 2 years deep. But the Bear had survived 2 hostile takeover attempts in his career and lived through the fallout of the Avro Arrow as a child in Malton. He knew that the worst storms always come in from a clear sky. The clause was airtight, I explained to my Legion buddies. Beauchamp had it drafted by his old JAG lawyer up in Petawawa. As long as I stayed employed, the company kept their crown jewels, no problem. But if they ever fired me after the bonus officially processed, even by 1 minute, they'd lose everything. "Everything?" Brock repeated, eyes lighting up. "Everything." That clause had sat dormant for a decade. Every year, every February, my bonus would hit, the IP rights would briefly transfer to me on paper, and then automatically revert back to the company when I logged in for work the next morning. Clean, simple, legal as a Sunday morning service. Beauchamp called it the safety valve. I called it the General's pension plan when I was joking with my daughter. But standing outside Wallace Carmichael's office that Tuesday in October, listening to raised voices through the heavy walnut door, I knew Hayden was about to push the world into a new orbit. Wallace was fighting for his legacy, and he didn't even know it. 7 months earlier, he'd announced a merger with Boreal Defense Group out of Calgary, a $310 million deal that would have made Cascade the dominant cybersecurity contractor for the entire Canadian forces, with a real foothold into Five Eyes contracts. Trouble was, that whole merger depended entirely on the encryption suite I'd designed. See, the technology wasn't just software, I told Brock and Dean. It was a complete security architecture, top to bottom. D&D had been running our protocols on everything from Aurora Maritime Patrol comms to the new submarine fleet coordination links. You can't just rip that out and replace it with something off the shelf. That's not how this works. The door opened. Wallace looked like he'd aged 5 years in the 7 days since I'd last seen him. He had grey patches in his beard I'd never noticed before, and his tie was crooked. Hayden bounced in behind me, practically vibrating with excitement, as if he was about to host his own little awards show. "Calvin," Wallace said, skipping any pleasantries, "we're making some organizational changes." Hayden stepped forward, chest puffed out. "Effective immediately, your employment with Cascade Defense Technologies is terminated." He slid a termination letter across the mahogany desk. Clean, professional, final. Dated exactly 48 hours before my $95,000 bonus was scheduled to pay out. I picked up the pen and signed without a word. No arguments, no protests, just my signature on the dotted line. Hayden had expected drama, shouting, pleading, maybe some desperate negotiation about severance. Instead, I just stood up, straightened my tie, and headed for the door. "That's it?" Hayden called after me. "No speech? No threats?" I turned back, looked him right in the eye. "Good luck with the Boreal deal, son." The confusion that bloomed across his face was a thing of beauty. He had absolutely no idea what he'd just done. Brock was grinning now. And that's when the fun started. "No," I corrected, "that's when the timer started. 48 hours until bonus payment. 48 hours until the kid learned that trying to claw back $95,000 was about to cost his family $50 million and 400 jobs. So there I was," I continued, taking a sip of my pint, walking out of Cascade with a banker's box of personal items, a framed photo of my daughter at her McGill convocation, the brass shell casing the bear had given me when he retired, a half-dead spider plant, escorted to my truck by a junior HR coordinator like I was some kind of security risk. 23 years protecting Canadian submarine communications, 2 tours overseas, and there I was being walked to the parking lot like a shoplifter by a young woman who probably couldn't find Esquimalt on a map. Dean McIntyre laughed. "Brother, I've been there. There's nothing worse than the perp walk when you know you've done nothing wrong. But here's the thing," I said. The minute I got back to my apartment in Streetsville, my phone started buzzing like a sonar console during a torpedo run. I'd barely gotten my truck into the underground parking when Brock himself called me. At the time he was working out of Halifax for one of our competitors. "Cal, what in the hell happened over there?" Words already moving through the network that some Bay Street punk fired you right before the Boreal deal closes. That's the thing about the Canadian defense community. We're tight. Tighter than people realize. When someone with my clearance level and track record suddenly becomes available, every contractor between Victoria and St. John's knows about it before the ink on the termination paperwork is dry. Just Hayden being Hayden, I'd told Brock at the time, nothing I can't handle. "Brother, you built half the encryption stack the RCN runs on. If you're available, I've got 3 programs at General Dynamics Land Systems that could use you tomorrow. Still got your top secret clearance current. Current through next April." That was call number 1. Before I could even crack a Coors Light open in my own kitchen, Dean McIntyre was on the line from his consulting firm in Ottawa. "Cow, I heard you got punted. Carmichael lose his mind." His son made the call. "Hayden? That preppy little smirk face? Hell, Cal, that kid couldn't navigate his way out of a Tim Hortons drive-thru with a GPS and a guide dog. What's Wallace thinking?" I was starting to realize something Hayden definitely hadn't counted on. In a single afternoon, I'd already received 3 concrete job offers from major Canadian defense primes. The kid thought he was killing my career. Instead, he just sent out a memo to the entire industry announcing that Calvin Thibault was on the market. But the call that really mattered came while I was thawing out a tray of leftover Montreal smoked meat. "Calvin Thibault speaking. This is Quinn Hollister with North Star Defense Systems." Now Hollister was smart money. His company had been circling Cascade for nearly 2 years, looking for a window. Quinn's voice was clipped, controlled, the way a captain sounds when he's just picked up a passive sonar contact he can't quite identify. "My legal team flagged something an hour ago," Quinn continued. "In the merger documents Cascade filed with the Competition Bureau, there's a personnel continuity clause that names you specifically as essential to the technology transfer. It says if you're not employed by Cascade at closing, we have the right to walk. I sat down at my kitchen table, looking at the countdown timer I'd built years ago on my home computer. A little Python script I wrote on a slow weekend that just ticks down to the next bonus payment. 47 hours, 23 minutes, 14 seconds. That's interesting, Quinn. Calvin, I'm going to ask you straight. Are you still employed by Cascade? As of 4 o'clock this afternoon, no. The pause stretched long enough for me to walk over to my liquor cabinet and pull out the bottle of lot number 40 my daughter had given me for my 50th birthday. My daughter, Annalise, was in her 3rd year at McGill, studying international law and conflict resolution, Dean's List every semester since first year. That $95,000 bonus wasn't just money to me. It was her tuition for the next 2 semesters, plus the last installment on the divorce settlement with her mother, plus the down payment I'd been saving for a little cabin up near Bracebridge. Jesus, Quinn finally said. Do they know about the personnel clause? I doubt it. Hayden never reads contracts. He's the type who skims the executive summary and lets the lawyers figure out the details. Calvin, what would it take to bring you on with North Star directly? I watched the timer count down another minute. Let me think about it, Quinn. Things might be changing in the next day or 2. What kind of changes? The kind that make this conversation much more interesting than it already is. Brock was shaking his head, half laughing. You didn't tell him about the Bears clause? Not yet. I wanted to see how desperate everyone was going to get first. The next morning brought news alerts to my phone before I'd even put on the coffee. Cascade stock down 9% on the TSX on rumors of personnel changes. Some analyst at BMO had caught wind of executive shuffling and started asking pointed questions about the technology transfer in the Boreal merger. By the time I finished my second cup, Hayden was calling me. His voice had lost every ounce of swagger from the day before. Calvin, we need to talk. I'm listening. There seems to have been some confusion about your termination. Perhaps we acted hastily. I nearly snorted coffee through my nose. Confusion. As if accidentally firing your chief security architect was just a clerical mix-up. What kind of confusion, Hayden? Boreal's lawyers are asking questions about a clause in the merger documents, about your role in the technology transfer. Ah, I said, taking another slow sip. Section 12, subsection 4, personnel continuity requirements. You found that one, did you? You knew about it. Hayden, I helped negotiate that clause. Boreal insisted on it back during the second round of due diligence. They wanted assurance that key technical personnel would remain through the integration period. The silence on the other end was glorious. I could practically hear the gears grinding in his head, trying to figure out how he'd missed something so important, probably realizing he should have read past the cover page. Look, Calvin, maybe we can work something out. Reinstatement, back pay, maybe even a retention bonus on top of. I'm not coming back, Hayden. What do you mean you're not coming back? Calvin, this is your life's work. This is your company. No, I said quietly. This was my company. Now it's just a place where the boss's son makes very expensive mistakes. I hung up and called my daughter. Hey, Dad. Annalise's voice was bright, cheerful, that classic McGill student running on 3 coffees energy. How's work? Funny you should ask, kiddo. As of yesterday afternoon, I'm unemployed. What? Dad, what happened? I told her the basics. Hayden had made a power play, fired me right before my bonus, and now the whole company was scrambling. Are you going to be okay? What about my tuition? And that's when it really hit me. Hayden hadn't just tried to humiliate me. He'd tried to gamble with my daughter's future. Annalise had clawed her way into McGill on her own merit. She had dreams of working in international human rights law, maybe even with the United Nations one day. Don't worry about tuition, kiddo. Dad's got it handled. And Annalise, I'm proud of you, not just for the grades, but for how you handled everything when your mother and I split, when I was deployed half your childhood. You turned out better than your old man deserved. Dad, don't say that. You taught me what integrity looks like. You taught me to read the fine print. After I hung up, I sat back at my kitchen table and thought about those words. Integrity. The bear had built that clause to protect integrity. The integrity of the technology, of the company he put 20 years into, of the people who did the actual work of keeping our forces safe. Dean leaned forward across the table at the Old Salt. So what happened next? Hayden started panicking. By that afternoon, the calls were coming every hour, Wallace himself sounding hollowed out. Boreal's lead counsel asking pointed questions about intellectual property ownership. A reporter from the Globe and Mail business desk who'd somehow gotten my mobile number, and you just let them sweat. I let them sweat. I had somewhere more important to be. That evening, I'd driven up Highway 416 to the Beechwood Cemetery in Ottawa, walked over to the Bear's grave, the military section, not far from where they bury the most recent Afghanistan dead. Stood there for about an hour and a half, watching the wind move through the maples, the early November sky going pink and grey over the Radeau. "Sir," I'd said quietly, "I think your insurance policy's about to pay out." The guys at the Old Salt were quiet for a moment. We all understood that feeling, the weight of carrying something forward for someone who'd believed in you, the knowledge that another man had spent some of his own credibility writing your name into something important. 24 hours to go, Brock said. 24 hours, I agreed, and Hayden still had no clue what was coming. The next morning, I told the guys I woke up to my phone going off like a smoke alarm. Cascade stock had opened down 19% on the TSX. The business press was having a field day with the story. The Financial Post had a whole piece up by 8 a.m. about leadership turmoil at a key defense contractor. Dean whistled low. 19%, that's blood in the water. And the sharks were circling. Boreal Defense had quietly issued a statement that they were reviewing certain aspects of the pending transaction in light of recent developments. In merger language, that means they were drafting the walk-away letter. I'd ignored most of the calls and gone from my usual 6-kilometer run along the Credit River Trail, past the limestone outcrops, past the marshland, past the spot where my daughter used to feed the ducks when she was 4. The encryption systems I'd designed weren't just lines of code. They protected real people. RCAF crews flying Aurora patrols out of Greenwood. Naval personnel on the new River-class destroyers being built in Halifax. Special Forces operators in places I still couldn't name. When I got back to my apartment, there was a black Cadillac parked outside the lobby. Wallace Carmichael was sitting in the back seat, looking like he hadn't slept since I'd last seen him. "Calvin," he said as I walked up, still in my running gear and sweating into the November chill, "please, 5 minutes." I got in the car. Wallace had always been straight with me, even when his son was being an embarrassment. Military men understand chains of command and accountability. We don't pretend the world is something it isn't. "My son made a mistake," he said without preamble. "A catastrophic, career-ending mistake. Wallace, I've got nothing against you personally. You've always been fair. But Hayden crossed a line. He's young, stupid, arrogant." Wallace rubbed his face with both hands. "But Calvin, this company employs 472 people. Good people. Engineers, technicians, support staff. People with mortgages in Mississauga and kids at Sheridan College. People who trust me to know what I'm doing." I studied his face. The desperation was real. Wallace had built this company on the foundation the bear had laid, and now he was watching his only son set fire to it. "What exactly are you asking me to do, Wallace?" "Come back, work with us, help us close the Boreal deal. Name your terms, salary, equity, a board seat, whatever you want. Name your terms, salary, equity, a board seat, whatever you want. Hayden will be reassigned, permanently, to something he can't damage." I checked my watch. 6 hours, 14 minutes until bonus payment. "Wallace, in about 6 hours, none of this is going to matter. Not the merger, not the stock price, not Hayden's future. The board's about to be playing an entirely different game." "What are you talking about?" asked Maxwell Beauchamp's old Jag-guy lawyer. "Check the original contracts from 2014. Read Section 9 of my employment agreement. His face went pale. Wallace was sharp enough to know that when someone mentions a specific contract section by number, it's never good news. "Kelvin, what's in Section 9? The reason your son should have fired me in February, Wallace, not October." I got out of the car and headed up to my apartment. Behind me, Wallace was already on his phone, probably calling every lawyer in the firm. The guys at the Old Salt were hanging on every word now. Even Marisol behind the bar had stopped pretending to dry glasses and was openly listening in. 4 hours later, I continued, my phone rang. Unknown number. It was Margot Westbrook, Cascade's general counsel, professional, controlled, but I could hear the panic underneath. "Mr. F. Thibault, we need to discuss Section 9 of your employment contract." "I'm listening, Margot. According to our records, you have a performance bonus scheduled for payment in approximately 2 hours, and according to Section 9, payment of that bonus triggers a permanent transfer of intellectual property rights for the Cascade Core Encryption Suite." "That's correct." The pause stretched long enough for me to pour myself 3 fingers of the lot number 40. "Mr. Thibault, are you willing to negotiate? We're prepared to offer significant compensation, stock options, cash settlement, and executive vice president position, with Hayden Carmichael still in management." "No, sir. Mr. Carmichael's son will be removed from any operational role, permanently." I almost laughed. Margot, Hayden should have been removed years ago. Wallace just couldn't bring himself to do it. Why should I believe anything's changed now? Here's what I didn't tell her, what I couldn't tell her. That conversation wasn't really about negotiation at all. It was about something much bigger. I paused to take a drink, looking around at my fellow veterans. These guys understood duty. They understood that some things matter more than money. The bear hadn't just written that clause to protect me. He'd written it to protect the technology, to make sure it stayed in the right hands, serving the right mission. The encryption suite wasn't some corporate asset to be auctioned to the highest bidder during a desperate merger negotiation. It was a shield protecting Canadian forces and our allies overseas. Dean nodded slowly, and Hayden never understood that. Never even occurred to him. To Hayden, it was just another product line to monetize on a pitch deck. At 4:47 that afternoon, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open, I watched the timer hit 0. The computer chimed softly, the same automated system I designed years ago on a quiet Saturday in March, just to track when these annual events happened. Transfer complete. All rights to Cascade Core Encryption Suite version 4.3 and all associated technologies now held by Calvin Thibault, individual proprietor. 47 pages of legal documentation, all of it culminating in one beautifully simple fact. I now owned the technology that made Cascade Defense Technologies worth anything at all. Hayden had tried to deny me $95,000. Instead, he'd handed me intellectual property worth somewhere north of $50 million. My phone rang immediately. "Quinn Hollister, Calvin, my legal team just confirmed the transfer. You own the encryption suite outright?" "I do. You know what this means?" "I've got a pretty good idea." Quinn's voice had energy in it now. "Calvin, we've been planning this acquisition for 2.5 years. Spent nearly $7 million in legal fees, due diligence, integration planning. But here's the thing. I'm not even angry. I'm impressed." "How's that?" "Because now I can deal directly with the man who actually built the technology instead of dancing around a son who doesn't know what he's selling." That evening, I drove down to Montreal to see Annalise. Found her at her apartment near McGill, buried in casebooks, working on a paper about international cyber law and state sovereignty. "Dad," she jumped up and hugged me. "How are you holding up?" "Better than I expected, kiddo." I told her about the day's events, carefully, without going into the classified bits. But I wanted her to understand something important. "Annalise, sometimes in life, people are going to try to knock you down. Try to make you feel small, worthless, disposable. When that happens, remember 2 things. First, your worth isn't determined by what other people think of you. Second, the best response isn't anger or revenge. It's patience and preparation. The bear taught me that, and now I'm telling you. She smiled. You sound like Meme. Your grandmother was a tougher woman than anyone in that boardroom today. Dean was grinning now. So what did North Star offer? Exclusive licensing agreement, minimum guarantee of 80 million Canadian over 5 years, equity participation, complete creative control, a small office on Slater Street in Ottawa with a view of the canal. And Hayden? Hayden called 8 times that night, each message more desperate than the last. By the end, he was practically sobbing. The last voicemail was the best one. Hayden's voice cracking, all the smirk gone. Calvin, please call me back. My father's career, my future, the jobs of 470 people. It's all falling apart. We can fix this. We can make this right. But some things can't be fixed. Some mistakes have consequences that run deeper than an apology and a wire transfer. The next morning, the news broke like a tidal wave. Calgary merger collapses as Encryption patents change hands overnight. The headline was trending across every Canadian business outlet by 9 a.m. I'd been up since 5, fielding calls from journalists, investors, and competitors who wanted to understand how a $50 million technology transfer had happened in the span of a Tuesday afternoon. Stock opened down 41%, I told the guys. Trading was halted twice in the first hour. Brock shook his head. Hayden must have been losing his mind. Hayden was about to learn what it really feels like when the wrong veteran's name shows up on your termination letter. The press conference was scheduled for noon. Wallace Carmichael, standing behind a podium in Cascade's corporate headquarters out by Pearson, looking like a general who just lost an entire theatre. The words he had to say were probably the hardest of his career. Yesterday, Cascade Defense Technologies lost the rights to our core encryption technology due to a personnel decision made by my son, Hayden Carmichael. This decision was made without board approval and without an understanding of the contractual implications involved. I'd watched it live from my new corner office at North Star Defense Systems in downtown Ottawa, smaller than my old one but with a clean view of the Parliament buildings and full of engineers who actually wanted to be there. As a result, Wallace continued, his voice barely steady, Hayden has been terminated from his position and will have no future role in this company. I want to publicly apologize to Calvin Thibault, whose termination was unjustified and has caused irreparable harm to our shareholders and employees. Mr. Thibault served Cascade with distinction for 19 years and deserved far better treatment. Hayden wasn't at the press conference. Word around Ottawa was that security had escorted him from the building that morning, his company credit cards cancelled, his swipe card deactivated. Some trust fund kid finally learned that his father's name only buys you so much rope. What happened to him after? Dean asked. Funny thing about the Canadian defense industry, I said. Word travels fast and the memory is even longer. Nobody in the country would touch him. Last I heard, he moved out to Vancouver to start some cryptocurrency venture. Something about revolutionizing blockchain for supply chains. The guys all laughed. We'd all seen plenty of young hotshots think they could reinvent industries they hadn't bothered to learn. But the real payoff came that afternoon, when Annalise called me back. Dad, I just saw the news. Are you kidding me? You own the entire encryption system now? That's right, kiddo. Dad, I am so proud of you. Not because of the money, because you didn't let them push you around. You stood up for what you built. The bear would be proud too. Your old man's got a few tricks left, eh? What happens now? I looked around my new office. 11 of Cascade's best engineers had already accepted offers to come over to North Star, the whole naval intelligence integration team I'd built over the years. They'd rather work for me than for whoever Wallace brought in to replace me. Now we built something better. North Star's got D&D contracts worth almost $600 million over the next 5 years. And Annalise, your tuition's covered. Right through law school, if that's where you decide to go. And the cabin embrace bridge, I'm closing on it next month. But the conversation that meant the most came later that week. Quinn knocked on my office door right around 5 o'clock. Calvin, got a minute? What's up? Just got off the phone with Rear Admiral Foster at NDHQ. They want to fast-track the maritime cyber contract. Apparently, the brass is impressed with how we handled the transition. Smooth handover, no service disruption, no security incidents. That felt better than the money, better than the equity, better than watching Hayden's world collapse. Knowing that the work still mattered, that Canadian forces would continue to have one of the best encryption technologies in the Alliance. There's something else, Quinn continued. The Admiral wants to establish a scholarship program. Military families, kids whose parents served in the Canadian forces. He wants you to help run it. I thought about the bear, about the values he'd tried to protect, about Annalise working late in her McGill apartment, chasing her dreams because her father had served his country and been able to come home and pay the bills. I'd be honored. Brock raised his pint. So what's the moral of the story, Cal? I thought about it for a moment. About Hayden, probably sitting in some Yowtown co-working space right now, trying to convince angel investors that his blockchain idea would change global logistics. About Wallace, retreated to his cottage on Stony Lake, wondering where he'd gone wrong as a father. About the 470 Cascade employees who'd mostly found new jobs at North Star or our competitors because companies needed good people. The moral? Read your contracts, know your worth, and remember that the people who tried to diminish you usually end up diminishing themselves. And, Dean prompted, and sometimes losing your job is the best thing that's ever happened to you. 3 months later, Cascade Defense Technologies filed for protection under the CCAA. The remaining patents were auctioned off to creditors. Wallace quietly retired to that cottage on Stony Lake. The engineers who'd come over to North Star were building the next generation of encryption technology, the kind that would serve our forces for the next 20 years. But the story doesn't end there. Last month, I got a call from a young sub-lieutenant, fresh out of Royal Military College in Kingston, working on submarine communications down at Halifax. His name was Tobias Halloran, and yes, the same family. His grandfather had served alongside the Bear back in the 70s on HMCS Ojibwa. Sir, I'm starting my transition to civilian life next spring. I've heard about what you're building at North Star. Any chance you might have room for another submarine guy? Sub-Lieutenant, there's always room for good people who understand the mission. Come up to Ottawa for a coffee. That's the thing about military values. They don't retire when you take off the uniform. Honor. Duty. Service to something bigger than yourself. The Bear understood that. Hayden never did. These days when young engineers ask me for career advice, I tell them the same thing the Bear told me 20 years ago. Be too valuable to lose and too dangerous to cross. Build something that matters, protect what's important, and always, always read your contracts. The $95,000 bonus that Hayden tried to deny me hit my account exactly when it was supposed to. Contract law doesn't care about office politics. But that money was just the trigger. The real payoff was everything that came after. Annalise is in her second year at Osgoode Hall now, specializing in international human rights law. Smart kid who understands that the work I did and the work she'll do are both, in their own ways, about protecting people who can't always protect themselves. Sometimes the best revenge isn't elaborate or dramatic. Sometimes it's just being patient enough to let another person's bad decisions catch up with them. Hayden thought he was playing chess. Turns out he was just moving pieces around a board while the actual game was happening somewhere he couldn't see. Brock finished his pint and pushed back from the table. Cal, that is one hell of a story. It's not a story, Brock. It's a reminder. Of what? That, in the end, it's not about the money. It's about respect, integrity, and making sure the technology that protects Canadian lives stays in the right hands. I looked around the table at my fellow veterans, men who'd served this country, who understood sacrifice and accountability and the bonds that hold good people together when the wind comes up. Hayden never understood any of that. His loss. We raised our glasses in a toast to the Bear, to second chances, and to the lesson that sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is somebody showing you exactly who they really are. The timer on my home computer counts up now, instead of down. Every second a reminder that patience beats panic, preparation beats politics, and sometimes the person who tries to destroy your career ends up handing you the keys to something far better than what they tried to take. Hayden Carmichael learned that lesson the hard way.